Basically, what I'm hoping to accomplish today is to take you through just a bunch of examples of things that I think are what I'll call limited design, and then things that I think are providing other examples, with the hope that you will see something throughout this particular session that interests you or that you'd like to try in your own particular teaching that might help enhance your face-to-face or your online courses. The idea largely being that much of that work would take place between you and I individually, or with me and a smaller group of people as we start to explore particular tools or individual strategies that we have there. So this is sort of going to be more of a show and tell idea to hopefully get you excited about at least one of the things that you're going to see today, so that you'd want to actually follow up with me after the fact to try some of this. So there's sort of three specific things that I'm going to do throughout this. The first is I'm going to look at a bunch of different ways in which you can actually present your content online. Starting off with the ones that I think are the more standard ones, the easier ones, and the ones that you're all probably doing, which are perfectly fine in and of themselves, but tend to provide a lot of limitations for the students in terms of how we present. And then moving to ones that I think provide a little bit more interactivity, the ones that are a little bit better from an instructional design perspective and engage the students a little bit better. So, when you think of things, at least within society as a whole, and I'll have a bunch of technology examples here, that are bad design. We're all familiar with these. Probably the best and most common one, that at least for anyone who's used a computer for more than 10 years, was when Microsoft switched from Microsoft 3.1 to their new suite of tools. And the best example I can think of this is if you think about how you would go about the process of actually turning off the computer. What is the first thing that you would do?
Save all my stuff.
No, in terms of once you've done all that, you're ready to turn off the computer. What's the first thing you actually click?
Start.
Start. Seems sort of counterintuitive. You're ready to finish up, you're turning the thing off, and the first thing you hit is start. And we have a lot of examples of these in technology. Any of you that have ever used an external hard drive or a thumb drive on your Mac, the first thing that you need to do the last thing you need to do once you've saved everything and you're getting ready to eject it, because you don't just want to pull it out, because Mac will give you this little thing on the screen that says, you could damage your stuff if you do that. You drag it to the garbage bin. Right? Now the garbage bin, when you do that, turns into an eject button. But it seems very counterintuitive that, to essentially remove the device from the computer in a safe way, we bring it to the trash bin, which is the same spot where we send things that we want to get rid of and delete altogether. If you look at, and I've got one in my bag there, an older version of it, but the old Mac mouse. If you needed to recharge it, the actual plug to recharge it was actually at the very bottom, so you had to turn the mouse over, and you couldn't use it while it was recharging. Whereas most of your traditional mouses, as you know, will have the thing coming out of the top, so it still allows for use when it's plugged in. These are all things that, as users of technology, that we've really, in many cases, until someone points it out to us, it doesn't really dawn on us that these are examples of bad or poor design. And we do the same things when we present our content within these online courses. Many of you have taken online training, webinars, online courses, massive open online courses, even the stuff that we've designed for our own students. And one of the things that I think is positive with all of this is the simple fact that students, and for that matter us when we are in the role of learner, have a resilience that we're able to overcome a lot of these things. So there's a lot of stuff that we do when we design online content that might be limiting in terms of the ability that it provides to the students, that they are still able to overcome and persevere regardless. Thinking about a typical online course and how it's set up, and this is just one here that's in a open management program called Sakai. How it's set up is really irrelevant at this stage, but you have sort of a typical model that many of us use. We will have our content designed into individual weeks or units or modules, and then that gets subdivided into content items. For many of us, we try to present our content items in consistent order each time. So you might start off with your readings, then you might start off with some sort of lecture, and then there might be an activity, then an assignment, and then a discussion forum, and we use that. We repeat that order throughout, and that's sort of a standard model that we have. When we look at the actual content that we put together, oftentimes for folks that, particularly who are a little bit video shy or a little bit non-tech savvy, you'd be amazed actually at how much of our online course content looks just like this. Someone has gone into Blackboard or whatever learning management system that they're using and has basically just typed up stuff. You know, they've put in some headings, they've tried to use some bullets to get some white space in there and stuff like that. But this is a lot of what our students see. Not necessarily within our college, but when you're looking at online learning in general, this is actually the majority of what they see. If you have someone who can be a little bit more fancier in terms of their design, you might see something set up like this, but really it's just the same thing. You know, instead of having regular bullets, they've got nice little icons put up here, but the way in which the content is presented is similar. So from a visual literacy perspective, there's a little bit of improvement. But from an instructional design perspective, it's really the same thing as what we have when we see this. You know, so there's very little improvement from the student's perspective. In fact, oftentimes students will complain that something like this tends to be a lot busier and they're not sure the order in which things are supposed to go. At least in this kind of thing. Students are used to starting at the top and working their way down. In this kind of model, there are a number of different pathways to attack the content. And depending upon what you want from them, you may want them to start up here with this initial block and then move over here and go essentially from the top left hand to the top right hand, the bottom left hand to the bottom right hand. That's not necessarily how a student is going to approach it. They might tackle everything on the left side to the right side. There might be a word that happens to stand out to them in one of the bullet points that attracts them to it, and because there's no discernible order from their perspective, they just move to that particular item. Another common thing that we do is we often put PDFs in. This is probably the most common way in which we provide our readings. We are getting better in terms of our library resources with the number of ebooks that are available where you can actually go in and link into direct chapters that are available. These tend to come in a much more interactive format. But in many cases, these are just scanned items that we've put in there. And in many cases, they are very low quality PDFs. This is actually a good example of one where if I actually had this particular PDF in my learning management system, when the student opens it up, they can't actually highlight things because it doesn't have the OCR built into it. So essentially it comes in as an image as opposed to individual text lines that are in there. And unless you're careful with how you actually run your PDF through the scanner that we've got sitting up in Wilderman, this is actually the default. You actually have to go in and actually hit a specific button to turn the OCR on so that it will be readable, so that if a student wanted to just copy out, you know, these 8 words here, they can just highlight those 8 words, hit Control-C, and then go over into their document and hit Control-V. The other thing is if they actually have Adobe Writer available to them, again, when they are using this as a note-taking tool, when they load it up into their Adobe Writer, they don't have that ability to do the granular kind of note-taking that we would hope of them. You know, so if we had a printed copy, oftentimes you'd highlight, like, say, 8 words here, or you would, draw, underline something, and then draw an arrow and write a comment in the margin because you want that comment to specifically go with those. Much the same way we would use with track changes in Word when we're making comments to a student. You can't do that electronically with this kind of document, regardless of what type of technology you have, unless you're using a graphical program like Fireworks or Photoshop. Then you can still do it, but the number of students that actually use that for note-taking is actually quite small. Another common thing that we see is essentially what I will call sort of the talking head video, or in this case the sitting person video. One of the benefits, I think, of this particular one is it's kind of short. It's less than 5 minutes. It does help with the faceless professor syndrome that we often see in online courses where you've got the entire content up there. It's all these narrated PowerPoints, and PDFs and text and image-based stuff, but your picture, other than maybe in the first page where it says meet your instructor, is nowhere to be seen. There's no actual interaction where the students can see you actually talking and your mannerisms and hear your speech pattern, those kinds of things. So this actually improves upon all of these things. But if you have a course where, and I've actually seen online courses that have 20 to 30 of these over a 15-week period built into the course, and that's the majority of how the instruction is delivered. Oftentimes in these 5 to 8, maybe 10-minute chunks, but it's basically just somebody sitting down, talking to you, kind of like the way I'm standing up, talking to you here now. And again, from a student perspective, that's not all that engaging. In much the same way that, apparently I need a line of sight here, the narrated PowerPoints that we have. They're very useful for many respects. Many times, a lot of it depends upon how we design the PowerPoint. One of the things that I've noticed, particularly when I go to academic conferences, is I'll get these kinds of, well, actually this is probably a good example, where there's a list of 5 or 6 things that you need to do, and the 5 or 6 things that need to be done are written up there word for word, and in all honesty, as an audience member, you could read what is actually on the slide up there and get everything that you need from that particular bit of information without the presenter actually providing any context whatsoever. One of the things that I often suggest to graduate students when I'm working with them in terms of presenting in an academic setting is I tell them to consider their bullet points like the section headings of a book, which basically give you a brief idea of what's coming in the next 5 or 6 paragraphs. And what you say to the audience essentially is the content for those next 5 to 6 paragraphs. But this is sort of the common way that we do it. We have an image up there. Oftentimes it's a trite image that we pick because it has something to do with the content, but it doesn't actually add to the content in any way, shape, or form. And then another one that we often use, and it's a little bit hard to see with this particular one because the arrow is so small, but up there on the content, you'll see that there's a little arrow there. And this is an example of one of those point and click videos where you're watching it and it's saying, okay, now go up here and click on content, and then when this screen comes up, add in, enter in your login information, and when you're done that, click login, and then when this screen pops up, click on dashboard here, those kind of things, which, if you are providing a tutorial at the beginning of your course, which is something I encourage all of you to do, that it tells the student where to find things. The course content is going to be here. Let me take you through a sample of 1 week so you can see what the regular navigation looks like. That kind of thing up in the front of your course to provide students with an overview of how to use the content is a wonderful example. Having multiple ones of these throughout the course, unless you were teaching sort of a technical kind of course where you're doing a lot of this programming. So if you're teaching, say, a statistics course, and I think just about every one of our colleagues, every one of our schools has a statistics course in it. As you're going through the use of SPSS, having these kinds of videos would actually be quite useful. Particularly if you had a data set that they could download so they could actually see if they can generate the exact same thing that you've put up there on the screen. Beyond those kinds of things, and not to say that there's anything necessarily wrong with any of those, if you don't have those things in your course now, in all honesty, those are things that I would say are probably a good first step in terms of the types of things that you want to use. If you have those things in your course, regardless if it's a face-to-face or online course, and I think many of us in here, at least the folks that have shared content with me, I see a lot of that stuff already, which is why I'd like to consider some of these additional things that we have the tools for here at TUC, but oftentimes I don't see within our course content. So one of the things that I'd encourage, and this actually helps with this idea of the faceless professor syndrome, whenever you do a narrated PowerPoint, design the PowerPoint in such a way so that there is actually space for you within the slide to have a standard picture of yourself where the video is actually going and you are actually delivering this. So in addition to hearing you discuss the content, the students can actually see you interact with them in much the same way that if they were sitting in a room like this now, they could see you and your mannerisms and your arms flailing about and those kinds of things that essentially make you who you are, that humanize you beyond just a voice on the other side of these slides. Regardless if you're on a Mac and using ScreenFlow or if you're a PC person and using Camtasia, when you actually go in to record these, it's just an additional box that you need to click in there that says record video from, and it'll give you some options as to where your cameras happen to be in the particular one. Probably one that may be a little bit more technically beyond a lot of folks, because in all honesty, this is something that I learned as a part of my doctoral program in instructional technology like 15 years ago and really have forgotten how to do since.
I wanted to create interactive and visually interesting assignments in anatomy and physiology for my students. And I wanted these assignments to be easy to use and to be embedded in Blackboard for convenience. I developed a few examples for material that I will use in the upcoming semester for my students. And I used a program called Flash. In the first figure of the lateral skull, where we teach the axial skeleton, the students have to identify bones, anatomical landmarks, and joints. Typically, this is either challenging for students or it's labor intensive. As a student rolls over the button or the hotspot, the color changes, and then they get some information about the structure and or function of the bone. Some examples identify the bone and the bone marking that they would need to learn. Some of the buttons or the hotspots identify the joint in terms of structure and function. I think this will help students because although they have the figures in their books, typically they have more structures identified in the books than they need to know. So hopefully this will save them some time and allow them to focus on what I want them to know.
Essentially what you're looking at here is this is a Flash applet that the faculty developed that essentially has, as you can see, a map of the human brain, at least an outline of parts of the brain there. And what the student has the ability to do is go in and click on each of those blue dots. And every time they click on a blue dot, a little bit of text will appear that describes what it is that part of the brain is looking at. Which is a very basic application for Flash and could be done in any number of contexts. So if you're looking at where you're trying to describe a particular room that a student has to become familiar with. I think I'm good. We found a workaround, so we're just going to continue to use that. Thanks to Linda. And but say if you had a particular clinical room that the student needs to be familiar where things are and those kinds of things, you could have an image of that room built in there with those little dots around the place and having them click on it. And in this case, just text appears when you click on the item, but you have the ability to actually encode video in there. You have the ability to encode audio in there so that you can provide multiple ways of actually looking at this. So from a diagrammic kind of way, it actually is a very nice little asynchronous tool that you could use within your own classroom. Another example, and this is actually one that is a little bit more sophisticated, but when you break it down, not all that difficult.
Hey there. That's me. Not the one with the long blonde hair, the other one. Want to know what I was thinking about? Honestly, I couldn't tell you. But I can tell you what I wasn't thinking about. I wasn't thinking about which notes are in the scale I was using. I wasn't thinking about whether or not my fingers could do what I wanted them to do. Check out this guy. No idea what he's thinking. I can barely reach my kitchen cabinets. I can tell you what he's not thinking. He's not thinking about how strong his legs have to be to do that. He's not thinking about the laps he ran in practice to make that possible. All right, how about her? Same thing, right? You get the idea. In the moment, we're just doing. But a lot goes into just doing. Think of something you're good at. Maybe it's a sport. Maybe it's playing the guitar. Maybe it's dance or yoga. How did you get good at it? Chances are you put in a lot of practice. And if you're very good at something, you probably broke down your sport or activity into small skills and worked on those skills. Maybe you worked on specific muscles, like an athlete, weightlifting, or a musician, playing her scales. If you've done this, you know that the process of getting good can be fun at times, but could also be difficult at times. If you want to be good, though, you'll tough it out. This class is a lot like an athletic camp, except we're going to be working that big muscle above your neck. At times it will be interesting. At times it's going to be a little tedious. You might even be frustrated. But if you do the work, you're going to get stronger, a lot stronger. And in this context here at Sacred Heart, that means you're going to become a better thinker.
Now, in this case, as you may have figured out, essentially Michael here is standing in front of a green screen. And what he had done prior to that is he had gone out online and found a bunch of images or short video clips that he had wanted to use. He had gone into a basic video editing program like Camtasia, ScreenFlow, Jing, and had just added those in. And then from there, he had basically given it to the green screen guy that we had at Sacred Heart, and that was embedded into behind him as he's standing in front of the green screen. In fact, the most difficult part of this process was the fact that it took Michael 17 takes to actually get that sort of in that kind of polished way that you see there. So it looks very professional in terms of how it's done, but really when you break it down into the component parts, it took him about 90 minutes to find the pieces of video and the images as he was going out and actually just went into Google Images and typed in copyright free, and then he would type in whatever he happened to be looking for. A singer, a picture of a yoga person, that kind of stuff. Took him about 90 minutes to find those things, about 45 minutes to splice it together, and then apparently 4.5 hours to actually do his little thing. But that's largely because Michael's a bit of a perfectionist and wanted it to be very perfect as he did, which is why it took him 17 takes to do it. I actually saw the first 4 takes. I left after that point because, once you hear the speech 4 times, it sort of gets a little dry after that. In all honesty, I thought take 2 and take 4 were perfectly fine in my opinion. Michael, on the other hand, was a bit of a perfectionist about it. But we have a green screen here at the university. For that matter, in all honesty, it's not that difficult to be able to splice these kinds of things together without a green screen, just using Camtasia. It just is a matter of having a bit of thought beforehand where you're actually writing out the entire script, memorizing it, or in the case of Michael, we actually had a full recording studio at Sacred Heart, so he's got a teleprompter in front of him, which is oftentimes where his mistakes came from. He would misread something off of the teleprompter. I think if he had just gone off the top of his head or tried to memorize it, it would have been a lot quicker in terms of how to actually engage. But this was the introductory video for a course called The Art of Thinking that we made all of our freshmen do as part of the Common Core curriculum that we had at Sacred Heart. This little 2-minute video was essentially the introduction to both the course and the instructor. The very next thing that the students hit in Blackboard was actually the syllabus for the course. And when you're looking at these kinds of things, they don't necessarily have to be incredibly high tech. As an example,
hello, welcome to Art of Thinking. I am Gordon Purvis. I'll be your instructor for these video series. I'd like to use this video to introduce the basic idea of what Art of Thinking is trying to do. This is a course on critical thinking. What that means at heart, we're going to talk a whole lot more about that obviously as the semester goes along, but the core idea is that this is the study of reasons. What makes something a good reason to believe something or a good reason to act in a certain way? What is a good reason and what differentiates a good reason from a bad reason? Now, that's the big idea. Now, taken as the idea for a course, particularly a required course, there's a natural question that arises of why. Why do we need to study good reasoning? Right? We've all made it this far in life. We obviously all can succeed to a certain extent. So why do we need to have a special course here? The reason, the big reason we need to have a course on critical thinking is because we're really bad as humans. We're really bad at judging when we're reasoning well and when we're reasoning poorly. So I thought I'd get this whole thing started with just a little thought experiment, a little example to illustrate humans as poor reasoners, and particularly humans as poor judges of when we're poor reasoners. Right? And it's a little puzzle called the Monty Hall problem. Right? So here's the basic idea. Right? Suppose that I am the host of a game show. Monty Hall himself was the host of a game show called Let's Make a Deal. All right, suppose that I'm the host of a game show and I present you, the contestant, with 3 doors, which I've creatively named 1, 2, and 3. Okay. Behind 2 of these doors are goats. Behind the 3rd door is a big pile of cash. Okay? And so your task is to try to find the pile of money. If you can choose the door with the money, you get it. Okay? I don't know why goats are always the losing thing, it's just the tradition. So, natural starting point, just you pick a door, any door. So suppose you pick door number 2. Okay? You pick door number 2. Now the way the game works is I never open the door you pick. What I do is I open another door, revealing a goat. So there are 2 goats, so no matter what, there's always at least one other goat out there. And so if you pick door number 2 and I say, interesting, good thing you didn't pick door number 3, I open that and show that there was a goat behind there. And now here's the challenge. You get one last chance. You can stick with your original choice of door number 2, or you can switch to door number 1. So one of the doors has goats, one of them has $1 million, and the puzzle is, does it matter? And so there are 3 basic strategies we could use to approach this problem. Okay? We could say it's better to stick with your initial choice. We could say it's better to switch. Or we could say it's just like flipping a coin. It's 50-50 odds, 1 goat, 1 pile of cash. Choose whichever, it doesn't matter. Right? There's no better strategy. Those are the 3 options. Okay? Now, take a moment, think about it, what you would choose. Okay? Keeping in mind that everything to this point is how the game always works. You know that as the player. Now, here's where things get a little bit funny. Overwhelmingly, people's initial instinct is to stick with your guns, to stick with what your gut instinct was initially. If you push people to say why is that a good idea, they overwhelmingly say, well, really it doesn't matter, but I feel really bad if I switched and lost or something like that. But if we're talking about probabilities, it's 50-50 odds. Almost everybody reaches that point after thinking about it for a little while, particularly if you have a whole lot of training in probability theory. Almost everyone is wrong, though. That's the thing here. Our intuition that this is 1 goat, $1 million, pile of $1 million, that's it, we don't know anything else, it's like flipping a coin, is really, really strong. That instinct is really strong. It's also wrong. And overwhelmingly people think about this problem wrongly. Now, and moreover, the reason it's wrong is not difficult to understand. The way to understand it, or one of many ways to understand it, is to think, okay, what's the probability that you're right with your initial choice? Well, it's always 1 in 3, right? One of the 3 doors had a big pile of cash, the other 2 have goats, so you're right 1/3 of the time. So when is it wrong to switch to the other door? Only if you were right with your initial choice. So if you switch from door number 2 to door number 1, you will win a pile of cash 2/3 of the time. That's hugely counterintuitive. Right? Now, if you think about it a little bit more, you're going to become convinced that I'm wrong. I'm not, but you're going to become convinced that I am, because human intuitions just don't capture these kinds of critical problems and a whole host of others. And this is just one I think is particularly fun because so many people get it wrong. And it has kind of an interesting history. I invite you to think about it and look it up. Okay? So the idea here is not just to look at little thought puzzles like this. I mean, these are fun, they're little games, but the idea is to try to challenge ourselves to be able to approach new problems in creative ways, to be really critical thinkers, and to not just trust our instincts because that's what our intuitions say, but to say, okay, that's what my intuition says, but do I have a really good reason to believe that my intuition is right? Because it turns out it's often not.
This is the type of thing that, in all honesty, Gordon would have done in a face-to-face class when he was introducing this. In fact, this is actually where he got the idea from. This is the first 5 minutes of his Art of Thinking course when he used to teach it in a face-to-face context. When they had to move it to an online context, he thought to himself, well, how can I do this in a way where I can still engage my students in a similar manner to the way in which I would have done in the face-to-face environment. Now, throughout the video, what he'll do is he'll say, okay, pick one of these 3 doors. Now, pause the video for a sec, and you'll pick your door. And when you've picked your door, then unpause the video. And same thing when it gets to the point where, okay, there's nothing behind door number 3 here. Now, I'm going to ask you, do you want to change your selection or not? Pause the video until you've made up your mind, which is kind of the same thing you would do in a classroom where you'd say, okay, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to think about this kind of thing, as opposed to just waiting for 30 seconds of dead space within the actual video. Instructing the student to pause it is how you do that. But a very low-tech way, because essentially all he's done is he's taken his laptop, he has used the little camera in here, pointed it towards the whiteboard up here, and then started recording the same way he would. And when you look at it as a way of introducing the class and introducing sort of some of the basic concepts in the class, while it's not technically savvy or sexy or anything like that, the activity works in a face-to-face environment. It also works in the online environment because it's the actual pedagogy that goes into it. The idea of what he's actually doing for the activity is what is the sort of engaging piece, not how he's captured it. And in all honesty, these last 2 were actually for, the same course, this Art of Thinking course. You had one that appeared to be incredibly high-tech, one that appeared to be incredibly low-tech. Both fairly engaging in terms of, from a student perspective, as their entrance into this kind of online course. Looking at a different kind of example, and unfortunately this one is not hosted online, so I've got to do it right off of the web page. So I'll get rid of the video because it's just that song that you're going through. Essentially what this is an art teacher. It's actually an art history course. And what you may note on the side here is you've got these little annotations that are streaming basically every time you see this large, every time the video gets to this large thing, you get a new annotation. All that the instructor in this case has done is they have essentially taken a video of them painting the picture. They've gone into a program called Ejecting. It's a free program. Actually, and you can have things hosted at Ejecting, so you don't have to worry about hosting it somewhere else. And Ejecting, A-N-T. And essentially, it allows you to embed video or embed static images, and it will create a movie for you and allow you to annotate things along the way. So if you wanted to provide a text-based explanation of things that were going on, or you can also do an audio or a combination of the two. It allows you to do this, and the actual items appear as needed. One of the nice things that I've seen a lot of faculty, actually in the K-12 environment, that have used this particular tool is they get students to annotate things. So they will post a video in their learning management system that they want the students to review and comment on. But instead of actually having them post their response in the form of a discussion question or using voice threads or some other sort of interactive threaded kind of tool, they essentially get them to create a video where they go through and they provide their thoughts about the video in the various sections that's going on. So you might have something that's, a minute and 20 seconds in that caught the student's attention that they wanted to provide a particular comment on. That's where they would actually add in the annotation there. And you can do this over multiple individuals. So you can actually have one student work their way through, and then it gets sent to another student to add in their own annotations, and each one of them would actually get added in under a different name. So one of the things you'll note is here at the bottom, it lists off the username who's actually adding in the commentary, adding in the annotations. And in this case, it's just a single name you see every single time. But it would allow multiple students to be able to go in and do these kind of things, which is a much more interactive kind of way. And as you can see with this particular example, Not only does it allow you to add in video, but it also allows you to add in static images as well. In this case, he's actually added in both at the same time. So you can see the finished product and the product as it's going through. But, it's just another example of something that could be done. So when we're looking at some of the things that we want in terms of trying to encompass all of these kinds of things. But there's a couple of things that you really want to, remember as you're doing some of these things or trying out some of these things. Even with the limited design examples, there are some things that we know from an instructional design perspective that are useful things to keep in the back of your mind. For example, one of the things that we've learned primarily from the MOOC experiment that we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years, which in all honesty has largely been a failed experiment for the most part, but one of the things that the data and the analytics that have been captured by these things have told us is that the MOOCs that have the greatest success in terms of student persistence often chunk their content in much smaller ways. Many cases having their videos chunked into things that are 5 minutes or less. 5 to 8 minutes seems to be the sweet spot. More than 8 minutes, you start to see a big drop-off in retention within a particular MOOC environment. And for the purposes of sort of testing out some of these, MOOCs are actually a great playground for that kind of data because no one has to be in a MOOC. You basically are in there as long as you want to be in there, and the second that you get bored or that it's no longer useful to you, you stop going in. And basically using these kinds of design features is a great way to test what is it that keeps you there or that loses you. Is a 7-minute video better than a 5-minute video? Those kinds of things. One of the things that we often do is at the beginning of many of our videos, we provide a lot of sort of background or context that eats up a lot of time. You've probably all sat through academic presentations like this, where the person spends all of this time up front giving you all of this background information that is really nice to know, but not necessarily that relevant to their thing. And then by the end of their presentation, they're rushing through slides going, because they've spent so much time up front. When we design online content, we do much of the same thing. As I've mentioned before, particularly with our narrated PowerPoints, oftentimes we read out the bullets word for word as they're going through. When we're thinking about creating videos in general, and this is one that oftentimes we don't necessarily consider. And I'll be honest with you, I'm probably, of all the ones up there, this is the one that I'm guilty of myself. For me, in many cases, it's a lot quicker and it is a lot more fluid for me to just go in and record instructional video. I rarely ask myself the question, if I were to take an extra hour and try to actually distill this into a written-based form that had a lot of white space and had a lot of bullet points, would it be a more effective way of presenting the content to the students? And in some cases, the answer to that question, depending upon the content and what else you've got in the course, is yes. A couple of other things to consider as you're looking at your videos. One of the things is to, like Gordon did, record these sort of demonstrations. In his case, it was a demonstration on the whiteboard, but because we've got a lot of very applied things, particularly in our health sciences schools, where in your classroom, if you've got the tools or the equipment in front of you, you can actually sort of walk your way through it and show the students how it goes about, how you go about using it. You'd be amazed at how many times in online content, not necessarily here, but in general, we see those things distilled down, and any of you who've gone through your CPR training and that kind of thing, often the first couple of hours of that is stuff like this, even though the dummies are in the room, sitting on the floor. You're getting how to do it on, a screen as opposed to the hands-on kind of thing. So when we've got those kind of tools available, recording those types of demonstrations are quite useful. One of the things I know I do personally, just because students have commented on it in the past, every time I'm in class, my screen recorder is going. It's going here today, for example, and depending upon what my voice is like, depend upon whether or not this becomes a YouTube video and goes online. One of the things I find with that is that even in class, when students have the opportunity to ask questions, in many cases they don't, or until they've had a chance to sit back and reflect upon what you went over, the question doesn't come to them, but by then they don't have access to the material anymore. So simply just by recording what it is you're doing in the classroom, you can provide that in your learning management system to give the students another crack at what you guys went over that particular night. Another one that I try to use a lot, although I don't use as much as I probably could or should. It's very easy to set up a Skype session with some expert in your field or some practitioner that's out, on the floor in a hospital or in a public health clinic, or a Google Hangout or Zoom session or whatever you want, or for that matter, if you happen to be out, just two of you sitting down in front of your camera there and taking 5 minutes to ask them a couple of questions that you think would be useful for your students to have from a practitioner standpoint, or from some particular expert in the field that you might happen to know whose reading you required them to read the week before, kind of thing. One of the nice things about online classes is the fact that because they aren't limited in time, we can bring in a lot of people into the classroom without actually having to physically require them to come into the classroom. So, and one of the things, and I'm kind of glad the IT folks left because they probably don't like this, I always recommend not hosting anything within the institutional LMS. And I recommend that for two reasons. A, because the second you put something in Blackboard, it slows it down, because not only does it have to, like the video itself has to render and play and that kind of thing, but Blackboard also has to render as well. So you have essentially two pieces of software that are trying to do something if you have it located in Blackboard. I'd recommend something like creating a YouTube channel for yourself. If you don't like YouTube and are trying to stay away from sort of the Google tools, I would recommend TeacherTube, which essentially is a version of YouTube, but that is only available for educators. So that's always one that I recommend. The back end of it isn't quite as fast as what YouTube is, but TeacherTube, if you want to sort of stay off of the mainstream social media tools, TeacherTube is a good example. The other reason that I recommend it is the second that a student leaves your class, and particularly once they leave the institution, they no longer have access to your content. And for many of us, the type of thing that we present in our class is going to be useful to the student, probably more so when they're actually in their practitioner-focused environment than when they're sitting in the classroom with us. Having the ability for the student to be able to access that material once they've gone from us, I think is quite useful for the student. And in all honesty, I think is a goodwill gesture on our part. I think it actually speaks well of the university when we do those kinds of things. Looking at some of the better practices or some of the tips that you might want to use when you're thinking about documents, when you are putting up those text-based things up there, the first thing that I always do is I will go and do a print preview so I can see how much real estate it would take if the student prints it. The latest research that we have from the Online Learning Consortium says that about 2/3 of our students will print out any text-based material that they have in an online environment. Knowing that, making sure that we have things that, and it's always a big annoying thing of mine when you go into a bit of text and it's like one line longer than a single page. So it's taking up 2 pages, but it's only because there's 4 words in there that push it on to that second page. So going in and hitting print preview so you can see what that looks like is actually a very useful tip. I mentioned earlier about the idea that making sure that you've got OCR enabled in your PDFs when you create them so that they are scannable by the students, so that if they are using a note taker for those, or if they want to be able to copy and paste things from the PDF into Word, they are able to do that. In terms of just general resources, and I'll be honest, this is another thing that I'm probably very guilty of. Oftentimes, because we've got an LMS and we see it just as a repository, as we find useful resources, we just go and add it to that particular appropriate section of the LMS. And after we've taught the course 2 or 3 times and we just keep copying the content to the next semester, we often don't check the URLs from the previous one. We also don't look to see, because when we first created this, there might have only been 5 resources there. Now, the 3rd time I'm teaching this, there's 17 there. And from a student perspective, when you go in and look at it, they see a list of 17 resources. We might have those annotated where we tell them, why we picked that resource or what we think is important about it. But oftentimes we don't give them a sense as to, here are the 3, if you've only got time to spend on 3 of these are the 3 that I want you to look at. Or this one that I found this particular semester that I added is 10 times better than something I added to it 2 times ago when I taught it, so I should really go back in and get rid of the one that was in there 2 times ago. So going in and updating those kinds of resources, because oftentimes we use that as sort of a clearinghouse where we just continue to dump our materials in there. I mentioned earlier this idea about the faceless professor syndrome, and as you've seen throughout, some ways of trying to get around that, or trying to essentially engage your presence in the course. The idea behind it is actually tied into a communication theory called social presence theory, which essentially is measured by 2 things. Essentially, intimacy and immediacy are the 2 variables that they look at, which basically translates into how responsive are you in terms of your interactions with the students, and how much can the students perceive that there's another person on the other end that actually cares about them and their success. And oftentimes, if the only way in which we're interacting with our students is through a text-based medium, it's very difficult to be able to project that sense of caring or that sense of intimacy with the student. Beyond some of the examples that you've seen here, one that I use a lot myself, whenever I have to give feedback to students, unless it's typical, very technical line item kinds of things where I'm using track changes in Word, I'll just open up the document that they submitted to me, open up my screen recorder, and I'll just start talking. In much the same way, if they were sitting next to me, and I was saying, okay, you see in this section here, and so not only do they get a much more detailed and developed line of my thinking as opposed to this 10 or 12 word comment that is a much more succinct idea that I'm trying to portray. But they also get a sense of sort of my own thought process, because oftentimes, and you guys know this when you've graded student work, you're on to page 4, and because of something they said on page 4, it reminds you of something that you now should go back to page 2 and make a comment on. If you're actually going through with it and recording all of this feedback in terms of a video, the student actually gets to see that kind of thinking, because they might not have made the connection between what they had on page 4 and what they had on page 2 previous to this. And if you're just using track changes, it's not like on page 2 when you put the comment in there. When I got to page 4, I noticed that you said this, which made me want to come back and comment back here. Whereas when you're doing it with a screen recorder, you're actually scrolling down to page 4, and after you've read sort of this paragraph here, they actually see you go back and look at that and talk about what you saw back on page 2. Another thing that I encourage a lot of folks to do, not because it's good practice, but because it's the law, make sure that your content is accessible. If you record videos, there needs to be subtitles on all of those videos. Just uploading it to YouTube and clicking on "This has never aired on US TV before," where it'll automatically generate subtitles, is not enough. You actually need to go in and watch it after the fact and make sure that the narration that they've provided there is an accurate depiction of what you actually said. Similarly speaking, anything that's a text-based document that you might have, I would actually run it through that particular website right there. That's an accessibility website where you basically just go in and punch in the URL of something, and it will go through and find all of the accessibility problems that exist on that particular one. It's really interesting just to put various university websites in there and see how accessible the university website is. And I'm glad to see a couple of student services folks in there, because if you haven't in the room, because if you haven't done that before, I would actually encourage you guys to do that, because that's something that is, in all honesty, a real issue with many universities, and it's becoming a bigger thing. MIT, about 8 months ago, was sued over their open courseware initiative under an OCR complaint because essentially the free open course content that they had provided over the last 12 years, much of it isn't accessible under these guidelines, so there was an OCR complaint made to them. So as you're looking at these, and hopefully the goal that I want you to leave here with today is the fact that there's something that you've seen here that you want to try. And if that is the case, I'm hoping that in the next days, hours, minutes, that you'll email me and say, I would like to try to play around with X, or I'd like to try to do this in my course. Can we meet so that we can start to play around with it? Because that's really what I want to come out of today. Because, when you look at this idea of how technology impacts society, well, in all honesty, I would not recommend this book. I think it's actually a horrible book because he actually goes through and talks about 10 ways that the world is getting flatter, and then in the last 5 pages says, now these are making a lot of assumptions. Here's like the dozen assumptions that I make, and many of these probably aren't true. So basically you read 250 pages of stuff that he thinks, and then in the last 5 pages tells you that, I might have been full of crap in the last, 250 pages. But one thing that he does say in here that I think is good, that technology in and of itself will never actually improve or impact productivity unless it changes the way things actually occur. And the same thing can be said for education. The introduction or the application of any sort of tool in and of itself is not going to have any impact upon your student outcomes unless it impacts on how you actually teach. So unless it has some impact upon the pedagogy. And while I had more, but I wanted to give you a couple of minutes to be able to ask a couple of questions, and we lost a couple of minutes in the middle to the audio stuff. I'll finish off with this. If you don't have one of these books, and I've got 3 of the 4 that are up on the screen here now, on your bookshelf, to me these should be required reading of every single educator regardless of what level they are educating at. If you're not familiar with John Hattie and his work, basically what he has done over the last 20 years is he has taken a slew of meta-analysis, essentially roughly 1,000 or so meta-analysis, which are combinations of individual studies. So right now he's got about 53,000 individual studies in his database that include roughly 250 million students. And he's looked at, based upon all of these results, when we combine them together, what things actually meaningfully impact student learning. And in each of these books, and he sort of writes them from different perspectives. This was his original one, which was more for a mainstream, non-education audience. This one here is actually called For Teachers, a little bit more K-12-ish, but it's directly speaking to teachers. So basically, if you're in the classroom, these are things you should do based upon things that we've learned over the years. If you're more of an ed psych, cognitive psychologist, the black one is a little bit better. I haven't had a chance to read the green one yet. It's only been up for a year and a half, and just hasn't made it to the top of my Amazon buy list yet. So I can't really tell you who that one is more for, but they are exceptional books because when you look at the types of things that Hattie talks about in here, the top things that he has in terms of things that will meaningfully impact student outcomes, when you look at the top 10 out of the 137 things that he has listed in here, so the 137 different things that have been studied over the years, the thing that strikes me the most is that the vast majority of things that, in all honesty, we see in the top 25, not just in the top 10, are things that the teacher actually does in the classroom. How they design their course, how they deliver their course, and how they support their course. It's not to do with the manner in which it's delivered or the way in which the school or the university is structured or the nature of the class or the type of content. In fact, even the subject matter expertise of the teacher falls quite low on this particular list. The actual pedagogical and instructional design actions that the teacher takes before they walk into the room, while they're in the room, and then how they interact with students afterwards. Those are the things that actually have meaningful impact. And so when you're looking at all of these tools, the question that you ask yourself is, what kinds of things will they afford me the opportunity to do so that I can do more of this, right? So that I can emulate more of these things. And that's really where we're going to have some impact. So I've got, I think, about 2 or 3 minutes, because I lost about 6 in the middle, for folks. Like I say, if you've got questions, I can take a couple now, but for the most part, what I'm hoping is that I'm going to, over the next 48 hours, get an inbox full of things where people are asking me, to come and play with different tools or different ideas in their own teaching.